Have you ever noticed that look, that hollow, vacant stare in the eyes of someone who used to chase you relentlessly? That sudden stillness replacing years of chaos and manipulation. What you're seeing isn't remorse. It's something far deeper, far more disturbing. It's the moment the narcissist realizes the game is over, that the person they played was never who they thought. I've watched this pattern repeat itself more times than I can count. People who show up completely drained from toxic cycles that seemed like they'd never end. Maybe you know the feeling, that strange shift when you finally pulled away, when you stopped feeding the sick dynamic that kept you both locked together. Maybe you noticed something new in his behavior, a desperation that wasn't there before, an unexpected silence, or worse, increasingly elaborate attempts to claw back your attention. Here's what no one has explained to you. In that exact moment, you're witnessing a profound psychological phenomenon that Carl Jung would call the collapse of projections. Today, I'm going to show you precisely what happens inside the narcissist's psyche when he realizes he played the wrong person, and more importantly, what your awakening does to his inner world. Stay with me until the end, and you'll understand why your absence becomes the most devastating mirror he will ever face. Look, there's something most people don't understand about narcissistic dynamics. It's not simply about abuse or manipulation. Something much older is operating in these relationships, something Jung identified when he explored the depths of the collective unconscious. The narcissist didn't choose you randomly. On some deep level of his fractured psyche, he recognized in you something he himself had lost a long time ago, something he desperately needed to keep the illusion of his inflated false self alive. Narcissists operate from what Jung would describe as total identification with the persona, that social mask we all wear, but which in his case has become the entirety of his conscious identity. Behind that mask, there's no integrated self, no real substance, just a terrifying emptiness that must be constantly filled with the energy, the validation, and the light of others. And you, with your deep empathic capacity, with your genuine inner light, with that authentic connection to your own being, you were the perfect fuel to keep his illusion running. Here's the thing. When the narcissist met you, something in his unconscious recognized your light. It wasn't love he felt, even though he probably used that word constantly. It was something more primitive, more desperate. Jung would have identified this as a massive projection of his own unintegrated shadow. Everything the narcissist repressed, everything he denied in himself, all those vulnerable human parts he had to bury to construct his false grandiosity. That's what he saw reflected in you. Your capacity to feel deeply, your authenticity, your connection to something larger than the ego. All of it represented simultaneously what he most desired and what he most feared. That's why the dynamic was so intense from the beginning. You weren't meeting a real person. You were being pulled into a psychological theater where your role was to constantly mirror the narcissist's imaginary greatness while absorbing his projected toxicity. And this, let me frame this carefully, because it's crucial for understanding what happens when you finally leave. The narcissist needed you to stay asleep, unconscious of your own power. His entire strategy depended on keeping you in a state of permanent confusion, making you question your reality, doubt your perceptions, feel guilty for your own completely legitimate feelings. This isn't accidental. On an unconscious level, the narcissist knows that if you ever fully woke up, if you ever saw the dynamic clearly, if you ever reclaimed your energy and your light for yourself, his inner world would collapse. And that's exactly what's happening now. Think about how many times you asked yourself whether you were overreacting, how many times you were told you're too sensitive, too emotional, too demanding. Your experience isn't just valid, it's significant. Your awakening wasn't a mistake. It was the moment your authentic self said, enough. The process you went through, that painful awakening to the truth of the relationship, has a name in Jungian psychology. It's the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the process through which we separate from collective identifications and unconscious dynamics to become what we truly are. For the empath trapped in a narcissistic relationship, individuation begins with a moment of devastating clarity. Suddenly you see the patterns that were hidden before. You recognize the manipulation you used to justify. You feel in your body the toxicity you used to rationalize. This isn't purely intellectual. It's an awakening happening on every level of your being: physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual. And when that awakening happens, something fundamental shifts in the power dynamic that used to define the relationship. Now, this is where it gets genuinely fascinating from a Jungian perspective. When you begin your individuation process, when you start withdrawing your projections and reclaiming your energy, the narcissist experiences something his fractured psyche is simply not equipped to handle. Remember, his entire identity is built on a lie, on the need to constantly extract validation and energy from external sources. When you, who were one of his primary sources, begin to disappear energetically, when you stop reflecting his imagined grandiosity, when your light is no longer available for consumption, something catastrophic happens in his inner world. It's not that he misses you in the conventional sense. The very structure of his false self begins to wobble. Without your energy feeding his illusion, without your reactions validating his existence, he's forced to confront that terrifying emptiness that was always at the center of his being. That's it. That's what Jung would call a confrontation with the shadow. But for the narcissist, this confrontation is especially devastating because his inflated ego doesn't have the internal resources to integrate what it finds there. Let me put it this way: a healthy person who encounters their shadow, those rejected parts of themselves, can begin an integration process. They can recognize, accept, and eventually transform those dark aspects into something useful for personal growth. Think of it like composting. You take what's decayed, what's dead, and over time it becomes fertile soil. But the narcissist lacks the psychic structure for this work. His false self cannot allow any cracks in the facade of perfection, not the smallest one. So when your absence forces him to feel that inner void, when the mirror you provided is withdrawn and he's left alone with his real reflection, the experience is unbearable. And in that exact moment of unbearability, you start seeing behaviors that can seem confusing if you don't understand the underlying dynamic. The first thing the narcissist typically does, when he realizes he played the wrong person, he dramatically intensifies his attempts to win you back. But these attempts have a different quality now. This isn't the casual, confident manipulation from before. There's desperation in his actions, an urgency that didn't exist before. He might show up with grandiose promises of change, elaborate declarations of love, gestures that seem pulled from a romantic movie. He might contact your friends, your family, creating narratives where he's the misunderstood victim and you're the one acting irrationally. He might flood your messages with claims about how he finally understands everything, how he's had a profound revelation, how he'll never hurt you again. And here's the psychological trap that many empaths fall into again. They see this increased intensity and interpret it as proof that the narcissist is finally feeling something real, as evidence that his love was genuine after all. But what's actually happening is something completely different on the unconscious level. These intensified behaviors aren't signs of love or genuine remorse. This is existential panic. The narcissist doesn't miss you as a real person with your own needs and feelings. What he's experiencing is the collapse of his narcissistic supply system. You were a mirror reflecting an idealized version of himself, and now that mirror is gone. He's forced to confront his real reflection. And that reflection is intolerable to his fractured psyche. Jung would have recognized this as the shadow projection returning to its source. All the toxicity the narcissist projected onto you, everything he denied in himself, it now has nowhere to go except back to him. And this creates what in Jungian terms we'd call a psychic crisis, a moment where the ego structure is under extreme threat. In this state of panic, the narcissist will do practically anything to restore the previous status quo. Not because he loves you, but because he desperately needs you to come back and absorb his projected shadow again. And look, If this way of understanding the deep psychological dynamics operating beneath our relationships resonates with you, if you feel like someone is finally naming that invisible reality you experienced but couldn't articulate, then you're already part of this community of seekers who dare to look beyond surface appearances. Every week, we go into these territories of the unconscious, where the real motivations behind human behavior are hidden. This isn't pop psychology. It's a journey into the depths, where Jung invited us to look, where the masks fall, and the truth, however uncomfortable, can finally be seen. So when these intensified attempts to win you back inevitably fail, because your awakening runs too deep, because you've seen too much to ever go back, the narcissist typically enters a second phase that seems to contradict the first. Suddenly, the intense love transforms into equally intense hatred. The promises of change become venomous accusations. You, who were perfect in his idealized narrative, now become the source of everything bad he experiences. This dramatic swing between idealization and devaluation, this isn't inconsistency, as it might appear on the surface. It's a manifestation of what Jung would call enantiodromy, that psychological principle where any extreme eventually transforms into its opposite. The narcissist has no access to the middle ground, to complexity, to the ability to see another person as simultaneously good and bad, valuable and limited. In other words, human. He operates in absolutes, because his psyche cannot tolerate the ambiguity that an integrated self would require. This phase of intense devaluation is particularly revealing of what's actually happening in his inner world. When the narcissist attacks you, when he constructs elaborate narratives about your supposed flaws, when he tries to destroy your reputation or make you feel guilty for leaving, what he's really doing is desperately trying to project his shadow onto you again. He cannot tolerate the idea that you saw through him, that you recognized his inner emptiness, that you left because you finally valued your own dignity more than his approval. Admitting that would mean his grandiose false self wasn't as convincing as he believed, that his mask had visible cracks, that someone could see through the theater and decided it wasn't worth staying for the second act. So he rewrites the story, a story where you're the one with the flaws, the damaged one, the one who couldn't appreciate how wonderful he was. And here's the part most people miss. This rewriting isn't just for external consumption. It's primarily for his own psyche, a desperate attempt to restore the integrity of his threatened false self. But there's something else happening here that's crucial. Every attack, every attempt to devalue you, every toxic narrative he constructs about you, actually reveals exactly what he fears most about himself. Jung taught us that what we most criticize in others, what bothers us the most, what triggers disproportionate reactions in us, that is precisely our own unrecognized shadow. When the narcissist accuses you of being selfish, he's projecting his own pathological self-centeredness. When he calls you manipulative, he's revealing his own constant need to control. When he tells you you're incapable of loving genuinely, he's confessing his own inability for authentic intimacy. If you hear his accusations not as truths about you, but as involuntary confessions about him, a perfect map of his unintegrated shadow begins to emerge. And that, paradoxically, can be liberating, because it confirms the problem was never you, right? And here we arrive at the point that changes the entire game. When you stay centered, when you don't react to his provocations, when you don't try to defend or justify yourself, when you simply maintain your absence and your silence, something extraordinary happens. The narcissist is forced to consume his own projected toxicity. You're no longer there as a container for his shadow. Nobody is absorbing his poison, and that toxicity, without an external target, begins to corrode him from the inside. This is what Jung would call the return of the projection, and for a psyche as fragmented as the narcissist's, this process is devastating. I want to give you a picture. Imagine someone who spent their entire life throwing their psychological garbage over the fence into the neighbor's yard. Suddenly, the neighbor moves away, locks the fence, and all that garbage starts piling up on his own property. He doesn't have the tools to process it, to compost it, to transform it into anything useful. He can only watch it accumulate while the stench becomes unbearable. That's the moment the narcissist truly begins to understand that he played the wrong person. Not because you did anything to punish him, not because you orchestrated some elaborate revenge, simply because your awakening and your absence leave him alone with his own shadow. And that shadow is terrifying company for someone whose entire identity is built on denying it. Now, what happens next in the narcissist's psyche depends on how deep his investment in you was, how central you were to his narcissistic supply, and what other resources he has available to keep his false self running. Some narcissists simply find a new target quickly, someone else whose light they can feed on, someone still asleep enough to be hooked into their theater. These cases are the most common, because the typical narcissist has developed sophisticated skills for identifying and hooking new sources of supply. There may even have been overlap. He was already preparing his next act while he was still with you. But even in these cases, something has irreversibly changed. Your awakening left a crack in his psychological armor. For the first time, someone saw through him and chose to leave. That crack never fully closes. You might see his posts on social media, proclaiming eternal love with someone new, barely weeks after things ended with you. That can trigger all kinds of complicated emotions. Doubt about whether maybe you were the problem after all, whether it'll finally be different with this new person, whether you threw away your chance with someone who was finally ready to change. Here's the truth you need to understand deeply. Nothing has changed, except the target. The narcissist is running exactly the same script with the new person that he ran with you. That immediate intensity, those grandiose promises, that feeling of having found a soulmate, all of it is phase one of the narcissistic cycle, idealization. You experienced exactly the same thing at the beginning, and just as that phase eventually transformed into devaluation and discard with you, exactly the same will happen with the new person. The only difference is that this time you're not in the cycle. You're outside, watching from a safe distance as the pattern repeats with another victim. And the part of you that's awake knows the truth. You didn't lose anything of value. You escaped a psychological prison. And the new person didn't win a prize. She was just selected for the same destructive game you finally had the wisdom to walk away from. This understanding frees you from one of the most common traps in recovery. The trap of monitoring the narcissist's life. Both searches, whether he's changed or whether he's still toxic, keep you energetically tied to him. Both indicate your individuation process is still incomplete. True liberation comes when you can think of him without significant emotional charge, when his life and his choices become genuinely irrelevant to your well-being, when you reclaim all the psychic energy you invested in trying to understand him, change him, or win his love, and redirect it toward your own life. That's the moment you know you've truly reclaimed your power. And here we arrive at the heart of what it really means when the narcissist understands he shouldn't have played you. It's not a moment of remorse in the conventional sense. It's not a realization that you're a valuable person he lost. It's something more fundamental and more selfish. It's the understanding that he played his strategy poorly, that he invested time and energy in someone who would eventually wake up and walk away, leaving him worse than before, because now he has to confront the evidence of his own toxicity. He would have preferred someone who stayed asleep forever, who kept absorbing his projected shadow without questioning, who validated him unconditionally while being consumed in the process. But you weren't that person. Maybe you were for a while. But your authentic self eventually rebelled against the unsustainable dynamic. And that rebellion, that awakening, that refusal to keep sacrificing yourself on the altar of his inflated ego, that's what he truly regrets. He doesn't regret you. He regrets his miscalculation. But here's the ironic and beautiful twist. His miscalculation was your salvation. The fact that he played you, that he pushed you to your limits, that he forced you to confront the darkest sides of human experience, All of it became the catalyst for your individuation. Without that extreme pain, you probably would have kept operating from your unconscious wounds, attracting variations of the same toxic theme over and over, never doing the deep work necessary for real healing. Jung would have said the narcissist was your dark teacher, someone who showed you exactly where your unhealed wounds were, your unset boundaries, your patterns of codependency, your need for external validation, your tendency to sacrifice your truth to keep the peace, your fear of conflict, your unconscious belief that love requires suffering. All of these things were in your shadow, hidden in your unconscious, operating without your knowledge. The narcissist, through his manipulation, brought them all to the surface where you could finally see them. And though the process was devastating, you now have access to a level of self-knowledge most people never reach. That's the hidden gift in the apparent curse. The narcissistic relationship, toxic as it was, became your portal to individuation. It forced you to ask who you really are when all the masks fall. It taught you, in the most painful way possible, that real love looks nothing like the dramatic intensity you experienced with the narcissist. Real love is quiet, steady, safe. It doesn't require you to lose yourself to keep the other person. It doesn't demand that you sacrifice your reality to validate someone else's illusion. It doesn't leave you exhausted, confused, and questioning your own sanity. These lessons, expensive as they were, are invaluable for the rest of your life. You now have an internal compass calibrated to detect toxicity long before it takes root. You can see the red flags you used to ignore. You can trust your instincts when something feels wrong, even when you can't articulate exactly why. And as you continue on your own path of healing and individuation, something else begins to happen. You start attracting completely different relationships. The people you connect with now are fundamentally different from the ones you attracted when you were still asleep, when you were still operating from your unhealed wounds. This isn't coincidence, it's synchronicity in the Jungian sense. Your energetic field has changed. You're no longer compatible with toxic dynamics because you've integrated the lessons those dynamics had to teach you. And from this new perspective, you can look back at your time with the narcissist, not with bitterness, but with a kind of distant compassion. You can see the tragic emptiness at the center of his being, the psychological prison he lives in, the fundamental inability to experience the richness of human life that you're now reclaiming. This doesn't mean you excuse him or minimize the damage. It means you've reached a point where his pathology no longer has power over your sense of worth or reality. So when you ask yourself what the narcissist does when he finally understands he shouldn't have played you, the most honest answer is this. He experiences a collapse of his narcissistic supply system. He feels existential panic, confronting the inner void that was always there, but your energy was covering. He intensifies his attempts to win you back through escalated manipulation. When that fails, he devalues you intensely, projecting his toxicity onto you with even more force than before. Eventually, he finds a new target and begins the cycle again, but now with a crack in his psychological armor that never fully closes. And all of that psychological drama in his inner world has absolutely nothing to do with you. It's his process, his psychological karma, his path of suffering that he unconsciously chose by never doing the integration work that individuation requires. Your path is entirely different. You're no longer bound to his psychological orbit. You're no longer the container for his projected toxicity. You've reclaimed your energy, your light, your power, and the relationships you attract now reflect this new level of consciousness. And the most important thing, you've developed an internal compass that can detect toxicity early, set boundaries firmly, and walk away from unhealthy dynamics before they take deep root. This isn't lost naivety. It's earned wisdom. This isn't cynicism about relationships. It's clear discernment between what's genuine and what's manipulation dressed as love. Remember this. Your worth never depended on his recognition. Your light was always there, even when he tried to convince you that you only shone when reflecting his imagined greatness. Your strength is evident in the simple fact that you could see the truth and walk away, something many never manage to do. And your wisdom grows with every layer of conditioning you peel away, with every unconscious pattern you bring to light, with every step you take toward the wholeness of the self you were always meant to become. That is individuation in action, and it's the most important work you'll ever do. At the end of this journey through the territories of the psyche that Jung mapped, the question isn't whether the narcissist will ever understand the damage he caused. The question is whether you'll have the courage to keep looking into the depths of your own psyche, to continue the integration work even when it's uncomfortable, to stay awake even when sleep was easier. Because here's the reality. Jung understood deeply. Individuation isn't optional if you want to live a meaningful life. It's your soul's call toward completeness. And that call gets louder every time you ignore it. The narcissist was one of those calls, impossible to ignore. And though you answered in the hardest way possible, through suffering and disillusion, you finally answered. You finally woke up. And that awakening, painful as the process was, is the most precious gift you could have received. You now have access to an authentic life, to genuine relationships, to a sense of purpose that doesn't depend on external validation. You know who you are when all the masks fall, and that knowledge, that connection to your true self, nobody can ever take that from you. If this has resonated somewhere deep in your being, if you've felt that inner movement that signals something true has been touched, then we're already fellow travelers on this path of conscious awakening. And together, holding a lantern to light each other's way, we continue the eternal work of becoming who we really are beneath all the stories others told us about who we should be.